Okay. So let's get started. We have two speakers, invited guests from Spark Cognition. Just to make sure you're in the right meetup, this is what we are discussing. We are Austin Big Data AI meetup group, and we've been around for some time. And we invite speakers from different industry, academia. We had about 6 or 7 in this series, and also I work for IBM. I do also get some sponsor from IBM for their meetup, so we're trying to grow it bigger and wider. With that said, before I get started too deep, so please help yourself with the food and drinks. It's been sponsored by Spark Cognition, and so yeah, so with the sponsors and partners, we have Spark Cognition today. They're sponsoring our food speakers. The venue is sponsored by Capital Factory. So please give a big hand for them, both of them. And Spark Cognition, especially that sponsored our up to now 4 or 5 meetups. So really, we're very encouraged by that. And so about our group, we do have YouTube channels set it up. We tried live streaming a little bit, didn't work go that well, so we're now kind of recording the events and then go from there. Slack channels for our 2 different groups, especially Call to Code AI. I see a couple of folks who attended that, and also our MLDL study group. So check them out. Sometimes they're busy, sometimes not, depending upon when you are checked in. We do have a non-profit organization set up for maintaining this cost and driving this meetup. So if you want to help us out, we do have T-shirts, all large size there. Please feel to pick up, and you can pay for the whatever cost it is. So having said that, our upcoming, so we have closed this year's meetup with a lot of meetups, and it's been a real success. Thanks for all your support, both from the members and the business community who sponsored us. So it's been great. So we are looking forward to the next year, and we have already scheduled these 6 dates. If you haven't checked our meetup group, please do so, and you can RSVP ahead of time. We haven't decided the schedules yet, like who's going to be the speakers, who's going to sponsor, whatnot, but we are working on it in the background. But please stay tuned. We'll announce it, and then definitely it will be more exciting than what we had this year. So all these are in the venue here, Capital Factory, and the dates are announced there. Okay, and with that, our today's special guest and invited speakers, Kevin and Sari from Spark Cognition. And without me having to introduce themselves, I would ask them to come forward and maybe talk a little bit about Spark Cognition products you guys are working on, the cool things you are doing, and also get to the actual discussion of the topics today. Thank you, Kevin, and yeah.
Um, so I did a PhD at UT in astronomy, and then joined pretty much directly joined Spark Cognition to work on the fun new field of data science and machine learning. So a bit about the company. So we have largely four main products. So I work on Spark Predict, which is why I almost called us Spark that the company. Um, the main purpose of that is working with kind of industrial machinery where they're hooked up to a bunch of sensors that are measuring temperatures and vibrations and pressures and things like that. And we're basically doing anomaly detection in a streaming environment so that we can point out when something is going wrong with the machine and what's going wrong. Um, so that's what kind of a lot of what I'm going to present is backed by or is developed for this product for the most part. And then the other one I'll talk about a bit is Deep Armor. So that's a antivirus client similar to your Norton antivirus and all that, but the difference is that it on top of it has known signatures for this thing as a malware, but on top of that, if it comes across a file that doesn't have a signature, it runs it through a machine learning algorithm to try to decide if it's malware or not. And the advantage being that you can then pick up zero-day um, zero-day attacks that haven't yet found their way into the lists of these are bad files or bad programs. And then Sari is our second speaker. He'll be talking a bit about the third and fourth of these products. And finally, Spark Cognition is hiring in pretty much all of these fields, as well as interns for probably all of these. um, so if you're interested, talk to me and Sari and maybe Randy, who's my manager. So without further ado, we'll get to it. So what I'm going to talk about is mostly unsupervised learning kind of in general and focusing mostly on clustering. I'm going to talk a bit about just kind of a quick tour of clustering algorithms and what algorithms are out there and what to use, and a bit about anomaly detection in kind of the same way. But I'm going to try to kind of focus on the second half of clustering of, nowadays you can throw a data set into scikit-learn and cluster it and get a result. But unlike supervised models where you can say, oh, I have an F1 score of this, it's really hard to determine whether this cluster model is better or worse than that one. And it's hard to interpret. There's not really tools out there for interpreting unsupervised machine learning models. So I'm going to talk a bit about that and kind of give some tips and tricks for interpreting and validating these types of models. So the first question you should be asking yourself before you do this is why are you clustering data? There's kind of a lot of reasons, but as we'll see later, one of the best but hardest ways to really validate an unsupervised model is by answering how well it answers the question of what you're trying to get out of it. So one thing would be you just got a new data set and you want to kind of poke around in it, plot a bunch of stuff. You want to see if there's natural groupings in the data, and just kind of learn what's in the data set. Another might be if as the next two are kind of ways that might help with a supervised model downstream. An example of the second one would be credit card fraud detection or something. It might make sense to have a separate supervised model for different segments of credit card users. There's people who travel around all the place and spend lots of money at hotels and airfare and stuff, and they're salespeople. And then there's people that generally stay in one city, and they probably have different kind of characteristics in their credit card data. So that kind of thing, like it might make sense to cluster the data to kind of segment your population and then build a separate model for each. A little bit less fancy would be just to cluster your data and kind of use that as a label, use it for feature engineering kind of thing. And then, the final way that I thought of, there's probably other reasons to cluster, would be, say if you have a fairly large amount of data, but you have some reason to believe that maybe a support vector machine or some algorithm that's not very efficient will work well for your data set. You can use just something like k-means to just make a whole bunch of clusters and use that for your training data, and then you'll have a smaller amount to throw at these supervised machine learning models, and it'll be sampled in a kind of smarter way than just sampling 1,000 points or something from your data set. So I think the most common reason for clustering is you just got a new data set and you want to explore it. That's pretty much what most of the tutorials out there are showing, is, here's some data set, we're going to cluster it. It's usually MNIST. And then these are kind of ordered where the higher on the list is where you need to really inspect your clusters more. If you're exploring data, it doesn't really tell you anything that, okay, this collection of points is cluster 1 and this collection is cluster 3. What does that mean? You want to be able to say, like, this collection of points signifies this population of people or something. And then as you go down, if all you're caring about is just decimating your data in a kind of smart way, it doesn't really matter what the clusters mean. You're just segmenting your data. So this is sort of what I generally use for deciding what clustering algorithm. It's not by any means a be-all, end-all, but essentially, if you have small data set, now I'm not really going to talk too much about what all these algorithms are. Most of them are in scikit-learn with the exception of HDBScan. They all have very good documentation that you can read more about them if you want. But if you have a small amount of data, I generally favor like a hierarchical clustering algorithm, just because, while it takes practice, once you get used to it, you can kind of read a lot of information from a dendrogram that you get from that, and you can learn a lot about the data and really choose how many clusters make sense, and do things after running it through the algorithm. Problem is that algorithm is pretty inefficient, so once you have too much data, it's going to take a very long time and take a lot of memory. So my kind of standard fallback is called HDBScan. This is the one that's not actually in scikit-learn. It's, as the name implies, very similar to DBScan, which is the density-based clustering in scikit-learn. There's two differences. One, kind of algorithmically, it'll find you clusters that have different densities. So you can find, this cluster that's very dense over here, and then this cluster that's very diffuse over here. And normal DBScan will only find you, a single density of cluster. And the other, and why it's kind of my go-to for anything reasonably big data, is that the hyperparameters are kind of easy to set. You just say, I expect there to be, at least this many points in a cluster, and then go, and then it'll usually do more or less the right thing. So if that looks reasonable, looks reasonable is very subjective. That involves a lot of plotting and involves a lot of the validation that we can talk about, that we'll be talking about later. Then you're done. If not, if you have some good reason to believe that your clusters that your data clusters will be spherical, which are generally not in real data, then you can use something like k-means or GMM but in most cases that's not the case. And then there's kind of a question mark. Try a bunch of other things. I put spectral clustering there, but if you get to that branch, you're kind of in trouble. So I promised a bit about anomaly detection. So if there are anomalies, or especially if there's outliers in your data set, that can really mess with clustering, especially the types that are based on centroids like k-means, because it'll push your centroids towards parts of parameter space that might not even have data near them. So you generally want to do some form of outlier rejection or anomaly detection prior to clustering if you're doing this in kind of a pipeline. And my go-to for that, there's really two main options: is isolation forest and one class SVM. Isolation forest is fairly clear what it's doing, and its hyperparameters are easy to set, and it's more scalable. So that's why it's kind of my go-to. And then I just wanted to call out, there was a paper a couple weeks ago, I think, on just an extension of that that does a little bit better in that what's plotted here is the basically the decision boundary, or the probability of being an anomaly. And you can see the standard one puts a fair amount of probability in places that have no data, whereas this extended one does kind of more reasonable things. But this one is not really, doesn't follow the scikit-learn API, which annoys me. All right, so you've clustered your data. Maybe you've assigned each person or each row in your data set, whatever you're clustering, some cluster. It's cluster 1, whatever. It might be an anomaly or an outlier. Now what? So the questions you should be asking yourself are to try to interpret your results are what makes this cluster different from the other things? Why did this come out as a cluster and not just as part of one of the other clusters? Maybe you find a cluster that's kind of interesting. What makes that one different than another one, than this other cluster? So kind of comparing two clusters instead of just saying what makes this a cluster. You can ask, what clusters are similar to this one? And this is all easy to do in 2 dimensions, but when you get to 100 dimensions and things like that, it gets really difficult, and you need some form of way of kind of ranking features. And then there's kind of similar questions for anomalies. Why is this an anomaly? What features are driving it to be an anomaly? And then on the validation side, are my clusters meaningful, or have I just kind of split the data in kind of arbitrary ways? So not necessarily the only way to do this, but the way that I generally favor is to use what are statistical distances. So these are distances like your Euclidean distance or whatever, but instead of measuring the distance between 2 points, it's measuring the distance between 2 distributions. So if you have 2 Gaussians, for instance, you want the distance, if they're like this, to be larger than the distance if they're like this, where they're overlapping. And so it's a way of measuring how different are these 2 distributions. And the reason that the way that we use these is you just kind of go through all of the features that are in your data set and say, all right, what's the distance between the points in this cluster and the points in that cluster for feature X? And that'll be 2. And then what's the distance between points in this cluster and that cluster and feature Y? And that'll be 3. And so X is more important than Y. It's kind of the intuition there. So there's kind of several options for the distance to use, and they don't necessarily give the same answer. Hopefully they give kind of similar answers. Well, actually, the list is a little bit different. So the first one on there was Cohen's D score, which is kind of an effect size measure. It's great if both of your distributions are Gaussian, like I said, but you're never probably going to have two perfectly Gaussian clusters and nothing else. So you can use it, but do so with care because you're violating assumptions. There's also KS or Kolmogorov-Smirnov distance, which is, you may have heard of the KS test, which is a statistical test for goodness of fit and things. But its statistic can be used as a distance. And then there's Wasserstein distance. We're going to get to these. And then finally there's KL divergence, which if you've done anything with like variational autoencoders, you may have heard of. It's kind of growing in popularity in the academic literature. That's a good one, but it's hard to estimate for anything other than Gaussians. So I'm going to talk about the KS distance and Wasserstein distance. Both of them are basically based on the cumulative distribution function. So if you have, in red, you have the CDF for cluster 1, and in blue, the CDF for cluster 2. The distance between those two distributions is the maximum distance between the CDFs. So as they get more different, that distance is going to get larger, and so your distance is going to increase. One downside of this is, well, there's two downsides of this. One is that it caps out at 1. So if you have distributions that are entirely non-overlapping, it'll be 1 if they're just barely non-overlapping, and it'll be 1 if they're way different. So that doesn't really rank very well when you're very far away. And 2, it places more emphasis on kind of the center of the distribution than the wings. So if you have long-tailed distributions of your clusters, which can happen in real data, then it might not be as good. The alternative is Wasserstein distance, which is basically the area between those two distribution functions. And that weights the wings of the distribution more and is linearly increasing as they get farther apart when they're not overlapping. So it has that advantage. I thought I'd remove this slide, but yeah, so I just wanted to go through kind of a toy example to make this a little bit more concrete. So what I did was just use scikit-learn's make blobs. So even though I've been saying this whole time you're never going to get spherical clusters, here's spherical clusters. And then just clustered them. This confusion matrix is only to show that, yeah, you know, the k-means found the clusters correctly. The labels get permuted because it's clustering, but k-means did a pretty much perfect job on this simple data set. No, this is what I meant to have, sorry. So here's, so yeah, I mean, like this kind of points out, this was with 20 features and 5 blobs, 5 clusters. And we want to know, all right, for cluster 0 or any arbitrary cluster, what makes that one different than the rest? Why is that a cluster? And that's what these plots show. So these are kind of pair plots. So each cell in here that's not a histogram is the plot of one feature against the plot of another feature. And they're kind of ranked by, this is the most important, second most important, third most important, and fourth most important feature as measured by either KS or Wasserstein. And kind of the way to read these is like, okay, so cluster 0 has systematically lower values of x3 and lower values of x17. Obviously, you know, in this toy data set, that's not any more interpretable than just saying it's a cluster, but in a real data set, that could be, you know, all right, it has systematically lower temperatures and systematically lower vibrations and systematically higher, you know, whatever else, pressures in some pipe. And so that then you can kind of hand over to a subject matter expert or an engineer of the thing that you're modeling, and they'll have some idea. Well, for in our case, or if you're doing like customer segmentation, it would not be an engineer, but some kind of subject matter expert should be able to say, okay, you know, this makes sense. These are this cluster kind of signifies this type of thing, um, and that's kind of a way that you can interpret clusters more than just saying, okay, I've clustered it now, so what? And this just kind of shows the top 5 ranking for the Cohen, KS, and Wasserstein. Um, the orders are different. Actually, Cohen and KS are very similar. The orders are different, but basically the top quarter of the data set is the same. So um, they're giving more or less consistent results, which is encouraging. And the other thing you can see is that they overlap a lot. So if you look at, or they don't the blue one, which is cluster 0, doesn't overlap in any of these with the other clusters, whereas if you go to like the bottom of the list, they're right in the middle of the pack. So it is ranking them in a reasonable way. Okay, so we've kind of answered how is this cluster different from the rest. The other questions, you know, why is this cluster different from that other one? You might want to ask, you know, why is this cluster different from this one? And then X18 wouldn't show up because they're perfectly overlapping. But what you basically do is the same statistical distances, but you just use your kind of your reference as the other cluster instead of everything else. You can use kind of similar intuition for I have cluster 0. What one is most similar to that one? By just saying, all right, for the top few features, what's the total distance, right? So each feature has some distance between cluster 0 and cluster 1, for instance, and then the most similar clusters are the ones that have the smallest total distance from their nearest neighbor. And then then you also want to know, why is this anomaly an anomaly for the same kind of things, and are my clusters meaningful? So for the first one, it's sort of a similar idea, but a little bit different because now you're measuring a point and a distribution. So what you want is what's kind of the probability that this value I got was drawn from this distribution. So one way you can do that is kernel density estimation. So that's kind of what's shown here. It's a histogram and then a kernel density estimate of the PDF, probability distribution function. And then your essentially, when that is very small, that means that the probability of that value being drawn from that distribution is small, and therefore that feature is probably higher ranking. Problems with that is you need to kind of pick the bandwidth, which can be non-trivial for not well-behaved data, and it's similar to the KS distance in that once you get, you know, a point here will be almost as anomalous as a point here by this measure, because once you get out there, it's pretty much goes to 0 and stays there. Another kind of alternative is to pretend that your point source is a distribution of just kind of a delta function, and the Wasserstein distance will actually work for that. The KS one, I don't think will. No, so what I'm saying is you've done clustering, and you've also, you know, separately, or maybe like the density-based clustering will also give you kind of outliers. Separately, you've done anomaly detection. So you have a bunch of groups of points that are clusters, and you also have a group of other that's just kind of all over the place. And then you pick one of those others, and you want to say, all right, why was this not clustered? What makes this different from the rest of the data set? The idea is kind of, this doesn't have any, but imagine there's just kind of a smattering of noise on top of these as well. So the idea is for some point like here that isn't one of those clusters, what features are making it not be a cluster? Because in some features it's probably smack dab in the middle of the data distribution, but in others it's far away. So you want to say, all right, what features, in what features is this value, is this instance far away from the rest of the data? Yeah, so it's a way of interpreting. Yeah, so I mean, for what we do, it's very important because we do anomaly detection, and we don't want to just say anomaly. We want to say anomaly, and here's what's weird. Here's why it's an anomaly. So we want to kind of rank the features for anomalies as well as clusters. Okay. So for cluster validation, there's a bunch of metrics on scikit-learn, like silhouette score, that claim to do this well in an unsupervised way. They generally all assume that your clusters are spherical, which is not going to happen. And so, and if you score real data on 3 of these metrics, you're going to get different answers. So they're really inconsistent. So I don't usually suggest using those unless you have some good reason to believe that they'll work, or if you just want some really quick and dirty thing. The best answer is really, you know, what matters for your analysis. So for what we do at Spark Cognition, we want to we use clustering to kind of identify bad states in machinery. So we want to know, you know, do the features of these clusters point to some problem that an engineer can identify? If you're trying to segment a population, it should make sense as, you know, different types of credit card users, to go back to that example. You should be able to kind of write a story around what the clusters mean using these kinds of feature importance methods. And then the kind of slightly more general and less subjective way is just that, you know, the clusters should probably be well separated, at least in their top few features. So they should not overlap, so like in these ones, the cluster you're looking at in the top 4 features, it doesn't overlap with the other clusters, so that kind of makes sense. If the top several features, that cluster was kind of butting right up to another one, you might have too many clusters. You might have just kind of split your data in an arbitrary way. Yeah, so that's kind of the general answer. There's no golden or silver bullet here for how to do it, but a couple kind of possible tips that might help. Yeah, so the main takeaways here, scikit-learn has made clustering your data very easy, but interpreting and deciding on what model is not. And I'm kind of proposing or suggesting to use these various statistical distances to try to interpret what your clusters mean and go further than just getting a label. And yeah, and then you can both interpret those clusters and kind of use those distances to kind of validate your model to some degree. That's all I have. Are there any questions? Go ahead. Okay. yeah, so clustering very much suffers from the curse of dimensionality. Yeah, so usually if we're in high dimensions, I will use PCA or an autoencoder if I'm feeling fancy, or some form of dimensionality reduction to get it down to generally 10 to 20 components, and then you can cluster in that space. And the thing to be aware of is that when you're doing that, you are throwing away information. So if you're looking for rare things in the data, that might make them disappear. So you kind of have to be careful about that. But generally, yeah. Good. I don't think so. What is? Okay. I've not used that. Sounds interesting. Oh, say that again. Yeah. So I think there's a couple ways. One is kind of similar to the pair plots that I was showing. So you can rank by what features are important for that cluster, and kind of plot. Um, actually, that is the main way that we use. So you'd kind of plot. You can plot the pair plots for that, and if you put more physically meaningful labels on these, it would be more meaningful. We often use histogram, things like that, to say, okay, this cluster is defined by higher pressures in pump 3A or whatever. So that's. Or were you asking how do you visualize kind of all the clusters at once? Okay. Oh. Yeah, so ignore either the upper or the lower triangle because they're just transposes of each other. This is, it's just picking two features at a time. And actually for the purposes of this, the diagonal, which is just the histogram of the feature on the x-axis is very useful as well. But yeah, I mean, to plot all of them at once, the most straightforward way would be linear discriminant analysis. So that's kind of it's sort of supervised PCA, where once you have the cluster label, you can reduce it down to 2 or 3 dimensions in a way that best separates those clusters, and then you'll be able to. It might tell you a bit of information of that it might tell you what clusters are more similar to each other, and it will get it down to something that you can visualize at least. I think you had. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Do you run into a situation where you don't have enough data for your training data set? And how would you deal with such a situation?
So we generally have the opposite problem in most cases. So we don't really do too much with oversampling or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
I know there are methods for doing that, but we don't really. In a lot of cases, we're kind of downsampling our data so that we can use something fancier than just k-means.
Okay.
I just want to make sure I'm understanding the feature importances of an anomaly. That's with respect to a specific cluster, right? So if there are multiple clusters, the feature importances for that same anomaly could look entirely different?
Well, so it could be comparing to a specific cluster. What we generally do is compare to
all
the
of the rest.
combination of all clusters.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, that was great. So if you have any follow-up question, we'll be posting his material on our meetup group, and maybe if he wants to do you wanna any follow-up information to contact you or something, you can post it there. But
Yeah,
thanks very much.
you can talk to me after the.
Okay.
after Sarah's
Yeah.
done,
So yeah.
and I can I'll post slides or something.
Okay. Sounds good.
On the meetup.
All right. Thanks, Kevin. So next we have Sari, and he's gonna introduce you. It should. No, it works for the.
Okay, so I'm gonna switch gears here a little bit. I'm gonna talk about automating machine learning. A little bit about, before I start, a little bit of background about myself. I also went to UT just like Kevin. I did my PhD in neuroscience. I also did a postdoc actually after my PhD. Then I decided AI is the hot thing, why not do AI, right? So today I'm gonna talk to you about taking machine learning to the next level. I guess right now this is one of the hottest fields in machine learning. Personally, I cannot keep up with the papers that are coming out all the time. And all the big guys are trying to solve this problem of how do we make machine learning something that we can automate. So really, if I can answer the question for you today, that's the goal. And I'm going to show you at least a couple of the methods that people are using, especially in the deep learning realm. So since it's a meetup, I decided to go more philosophical. So we're trying to automate machine learning. So I'm going to start from the last word, which is learning. And let's think about what does it mean for a machine to learn, right? Now, what does it mean for a human to learn? And it must have been studied before, right? We go back to psychology, and Pavlov in 1890s, using his dog, figure out that I can ring a bell and give my food to the dog. Now, if I ring the bell, the dog doesn't expect food, so it's going to salivate. There's going to be saliva in his mouth, expecting food. So then he wrote a book about classical conditioning. So that's the first literature we have about learning. It's called classical conditioning, associating a stimulus with a response. And later it's been studied in biology, and later studied in neuroscience. But then Skinner came along in the 30s, said it's not just classical conditioning, you have reward and punishment. A human or an animal can learn to be rewarded, so he learns certain behavior. Or you can punish that animal or human, and they learn to avoid that behavior. Then you have more things that psychologists keep talking about, like imitation learning, like you can learn to imitate people, etc. Why am I telling you all this? One thing you might have heard of is reinforcement learning. That's a method that's used a lot in machine learning these days. Well, it comes from this kind of stuff. It's reward and punishment. You reward a machine on learning, so you put an objective function that describes this reward, and that's how reinforcement learning works. So kind of these are the basic ideas that we get from psychology. Now in neuroscience, how is learning defined in neuroscience? Well, in neuroscience, there are neurons, just like the artificial neurons we try to do in machine learning, or we attempt to do. And then the first hypothesis about learning in neuroscience was done by this person called Donald Hebb in the 1940s. And basically he says, actually it was a hypothesis. It was, nobody ever recorded from these neurons or knew how they worked. He hypothesized that neurons that fire together are going to wire together, meaning there's these two neurons here. Whoops. If this neuron fires an action potential, and if that results in this neuron firing an action potential, the connection between these neurons will be more powerful. Or in machine learning sense, that means the weight between these two neurons is going to increase. Later, people found that that's true, actually. When the correlation between the activity of these two neurons is high, what happens is that the connection between them gets stronger and stronger. And then later they found that actually the opposite also happens. If the correlation is low, then the weight between these two neurons gets lower. And a lot of these ideas actually propagated into the artificial neural networks that we use today in AI and machine learning. Hebbian rule is more like unsupervised way of learning, just because it doesn't depend on the output of the network. It just depends on the activity of the network. So then we get to the idea of machine learning, right? That's the latest. That's why we're here. That's the latest stuff we do. And what we mean by learning in machine learning is basically that we have a model, and then this model takes in some data, right? And then gives you an output. And here I'm depicting what's called supervised learning, meaning that you actually know what this model is supposed to output. You have a truth, or you have some value that you know that this model predicted how to give me a prediction, but I know what it's supposed to predict. So this way, I know how accurate this model is. So I can say this is a good model or this is a bad model. What Kevin talked about is more clustering, is more unsupervised learning. So you don't really have the truth. You have some prediction of the model, but it's much harder to say how accurate is it. How accurate is your clustering? That's kind of like what Kevin was trying to convey. But in supervised learning, it's very easy. You give it a prediction, you compare it through, you say, this is how accurate is my model. And then using this accuracy, by comparing the truth and the prediction, the y and the y hat, you can construct a function, we call it the objective function, that says, this is my error, this is how bad is my model, and then let me try to minimize this objective function. And that's how actually you train the model. That's how you decide what parameters, I put them as a lambda, what parameters to use in that model to get the best accuracy. Right? And this is what if you do data science and machine learning, that's all you do, is you spend a lot of time fitting the model to the data and finding the parameters that give you the best predictions. So in a sense, that automating machine learning means that you're trying to automate this process, right? You're trying to automate, get the most accurate model from the data without automatically by machine. So what do you do when you try to do a machine learning project or a data science project, right? First thing you do is you come up with a question. A lot of times, as a data scientist or as a machine learning engineer, maybe you're not the one who came up with the question, it's your boss. Like, you tell me what's the projection of revenue the next month, or it could be some sales guy or business question that you're trying to answer. So this is like a problem formulation. That's usually the first step in machine learning. Like, there's a problem you're trying to solve. The second step is, okay, let me get the data. There has to be data that can help me answer this question. Maybe I can go to a database and get some data. Maybe the data doesn't have labels. I need to get labels from somewhere else. So there's the step of getting data acquisition. Then there's, I think, a lot of times this is probably the biggest step. This is what most people spend the most time in. And it's called data processing or data cleaning. A lot of times the data is dirty. There's a lot of missing values. Some stuff you have to get rid of. So there's a lot of these steps. There's imputation, there's scaling. Then also there's a step of, well, I can combine different columns in my data, or I can combine different features of the data to come up with things that would make my modeling a lot easier. So that's called feature engineering. So that's another thing data science would do. If it's a time series problem, which is a lot of the data we deal with in Spark Cognition. Whoops, sorry. If it's time series, then you need actually extra steps. You would need to maybe look at the frequency domain information. Maybe you need to come up with features that will make your modeling a lot easier. So once you cleaned your data, now you take the next step, which is let me find a model that will give me the best prediction. So you have, when you open a machine learning book, there's a random forest, there's a neural network, there's a XGB boost tree. Which one do I do? So a lot of times we see what others have used in a similar problem, and we use that model. Or you can experiment, right? So anyway, you pick a model, and then you fit the data to the model. You optimize the parameters of the model for the data. Then comes the step that usually people don't like. Well, for me, it's like you validate. You run the data. You run the data through a test set that you haven't used for training the model, right? So that test set will give you accuracy, or give you how good is my model. And a lot of times what happens is that accuracy on the first try is not that good. So what happens is you have to go back. You have to go back and process the data. Maybe you did something in the cleaning, maybe you did something in feature. Maybe I can create another feature and make the modeling easier. Or maybe I can just select a different model and try. Maybe I select the random forest, now I try a neural network. Maybe I change the architecture of the neural network, etc. Eventually, if you're happy with your model, it validates well. It's like, I got 80% accuracy, I'm happy with that. Let me just give it to my software engineer, put it on the data streaming, maybe put it on a website somewhere where customers can use it, and I'm happy with it. But even then you'll have to say, okay, after a while, you get new data, the model's not good enough, then you have to go back again. And sometimes you even have to go back all the way to the data acquisition, or even maybe you asked the wrong question. Maybe I cannot answer this question. Maybe I can change the question a little bit for the data I have. So the goal of automating machine learning is that you can try to automate at least the part from the data processing onto the model deployment. And this happens by changing the way the data is cleaned, changing the way data is imputed and scaled, generating different features on top of the columns or the data you have, and then trying out a whole bunch of models, and then picking the one that works, and then monitoring the model as it's being deployed, and then figuring out that if the model decreases in accuracy, go back and do the whole process again. So that's really the goal of the automated machine learning. And since this is so how do we do that? Is that even possible, right? Even on a theoretical level, can we ask this question theoretically, and is there an answer to it? And I don't know if you're familiar with Joachim Schmidhuber. He's actually the one, he invented the LSTMs, the long short-term memory neural networks. So he came up with this concept. It was called the Gödel machine. And it's completely, it's boundary philosophy is more very theoretical. And the idea is if you have an environment, and you have a program running in that environment, it takes in some input, and it generates output. So you can think about it, the program is your model. It's the model you're building. Well, he showed theoretically that you can have he called it a proof searcher. Basically, it's another machine that sits on top of this program, and that machine can read that whole program, and it can prove if that program is optimal or not. And if it can find a proof that shows that this program can be more optimal by changing the program this way, it will modify the program down here. It will modify the program into something different. So in a way, this Gödel machine is kind of like the one controls how the program behaves in the environment to be the most optimal. And in a way, this Gödel machine is what I'm kind of theoretically what I was trying to tell you earlier, how we can a way of creating something that would automate machine learning. So why automate machine learning? I know this is called the big data meetup, so we know there's data everywhere, right? So I think the main reason is like in order to scale our data science process, this process of creating models from the processing all the way to deployment. If you want to do this with all this large amount of data that we have, it's not really feasible. So to do that, you need an automated system that will make it more accessible to people, be fully automated, and maintain itself as the models are deployed. So when we talk about deep learning, it's probably one of the hardest things to automate, right? Because being that with its success in the recent years, with different hard problems like image processing and other types of data. So can we automate building a deep learning model, like a neural network? So normally, I don't know how many of you have any of you like trained a neural network? Yeah, good. So these are kind of like 4 steps you have to go through. First, you have to pick an architecture. If you're doing images, you do a CNN followed by a pooling layer. If you're doing like some time series, you might do an LSTM with multiple layers. So we start with some architecture. This is your first step. Then you say, okay, it has some hyperparameters, like how big are my layers? When I train it, how big is my batch? Do I put dropout? Do I not do dropout? What kind of algorithm do I train it with? What learning rate, right? Then in step 3 is I run through my training data, my training set. Typically it's by backpropagation. There's other algorithms like evolutionary search. Then you validate. When you validate, you're probably going to go back and say, oh, I can change the architecture. Maybe I change a different parameter, and you keep repeating until you keep going in that loop over these 4 steps until finally you're happy with your neural network and it's ready for deployment. Well, how can we automate all these 4 steps? Probably the hardest one is step number 1. And in the last, I would say, 10 years, people come up with kind of a couple of ways of automating architecture search. The first one is neural evolutions. Actually started at UT here in Austin by Ken Stanley in the early 2000s. And the idea is you encode each neural network as a gene or as a genome. So it's basically a string representation that from that you can extract a neural network. And you can use a genetic algorithm to mutate and cross over these genes to create different populations of neural networks, where you test them on the data, and whatever genomes do best, that becomes your next generation. On the other side, another idea that it's more recently it's becoming more and more popular is to use reinforcement learning. So basically, you will have an agent. Your agent is kind of like a model that produces a neural network or a model. So that's the job of the action is to find me the best model. So its action is to produce a model that you test. The environment is the data, actually. And the interpreter kind of like looks at how well is this model doing, and then rewards the agent based on that. So these are kind of like 2 ideas that are being used right now to do architecture search and to automate machine learning. So a little more on the neural evolution. Basically, here I'm showing like 2 parent neural networks. So each string here encodes a neural network, basically the nodes and their connectivity. And basically, what you do is you cross them over. So you take part of the part of the nodes and connectivity from parent 1, and you take the other part from parent 2, and you create offspring. So you create a child net of these two parents, and then you do that for a whole population of neural networks, and then you do mutations randomly, so to make sure there's diversity, and then you select, basically you do a lot of them, and you select the best performing ones, and you use those as parents for the next offspring, and you repeat that process for a long time until you eventually find your best model. Now the way you do this on the other side, which is reinforcement learning, is that you have to use a controller, or that's your agent. That's the one that's producing your models. So the controller kind of like writes down what the model should be, and then you take the model, you train it on the data, you use backpropagation or other training method, you test it, you get the accuracy, and that accuracy becomes the reward for the controller. So you can see here in the controller it says RNN. That means it's a neural network. So that means the neural network here is producing another neural network. And that sounds crazy, right? Like when you think about it, like a network that generates another network. Well, it turns out it actually works magically. I don't. So yeah, in the earliest paper in 2017, what they used is a LSTM network actually as a controller, and it will spit out basically a sequence of layers that describe the model that you are building. It's kind of, you can think about it as you can use an RNN or an LSTM network to spit out a sentence in, for example, translation. It's a kind of similar idea. Instead of spitting out words, spitting out type of layers in a neural network. So then you use that control network as your agent, and then you loop it through a reinforcement learning algorithm. Typically it's called reinforce algorithm, and then eventually after a lot of computational, you need a lot of computation power, but eventually you'll find the controller will find a model that works better for that data set. Another idea of networks that generate networks is it's what's called a hypernetwork. And that's instead of spitting out the complete layered architecture of a network, and this is actually an older idea, what the hypernetwork's job is to spit out the weights of the network you're trying to construct. And the way it works is like you have a coordinate system of each layer. Here you have an X and Y for each layer, and then you feed the two connect the source and the target to this network, and what it will spit out is your weights for that connection. And then you can put a threshold on that and say, well, if the weight is less than this value, then there's no connectivity between these neurons, and this way it defines your architecture. Now this is like, so this brings me to the product we're working on in Spark Cognition is called Darwin, where it tries to automate machine learning, and it does so by using various methods different methods that I describe, and these are just 3 examples of networks from, Darwin has been evolving a lot. This is like one of the earliest versions of Darwin, and these are like different networks that we use to solve different problems, different data sets. Like this one predicting the bearing failure. This one is like can take off a plane. It can't land a plane, but it can take it off. and this one was used to. It's actually one of we did like it's actually a neural network that I made it into art that I submitted to some competition, but it was originally used to like predict the Dow futures in finance as a model. So yeah, what is this brings me like, what is Darwin? So this is the product that we, Spark Cognition, have to automate machine learning. So basically, you can ingest data into Darwin. Right now, it takes structured data, but we're working on incorporating other unstructured data. We have another product called Deep NLP that can ingest text data, and we're working with that team where you can actually inject now text into Darwin to build your models, not just structured data. So it will do. So Darwin's supposed to pre-process your data, select the best scaling and imputation way on your data, generate features, select the best ones that are necessary for the model, and then try a whole bunch of tasks that you can solve, like classification, regression. You can even do clustering and anomaly detection of unsupervised learning. And you can use it with UI, like there's a REST API you can call. There's also Python. So you can use it in Jupyter Notebook, or you can use it in a UI that is constantly being updated. And there's even a trial if you want to try it. You can use a Python SDK to try it. So you can just give it a data set, and it will build a model for you. You can get the predictions and play around with it. And I'll take questions. Yeah. Yes, yes. So I only talked about deep learning. The question is like, does Darwin deal with other models? I only talk about deep learning because it's the most interesting and hard problem to solve. But Darwin also produces decision trees and random forest and XGBoost and other. It will try all these models, and they all compete. And whatever, for some data sets, especially on the small side, like decision trees sometimes work better than neural networks. So if in that case, it'll pick that. Yeah, it's license based. The free trial is free, I think, for I can't remember how many days, but then it's a subscription based, I believe.
How is this different from H2O's AutoML?
Yeah, so that's another product that's a competition. I don't have a slide. We actually we compare with all competition, and the thing Darwin kind of excels more is in time series data, because that's a lot of what we specialize in Spark Cognition is industrial and time series data. So in time series data we do a lot better, and also we are we're very deep learning oriented, whereas H2O is more about ensembling different models together. So there are differences. It's another solution of AutoML. Yeah, you had a question?
Have you seen, this is on, what kind of interesting failure models have you seen, or just ways that Darwin, a computer driving a computer off the rails that have been interesting, and are you scared for your job of Darwin eventually taking over what you do?
I'm not scared. I think, so looking over this literature for a while now, and I know it's basically you're trying to automate automation, right? It's kind of like you're taking, but at the end, it's like when you think about it, it's like, what is this automation doing? Like right now, we're predicting, for example, our model is predicting failure on a wind turbine, or it's clustering, showing customer clusters of data somewhere. So giving that control to the machine is like, what is it going to do? Tell you there's failure all the time? So I'm not, in terms of Darwin and its application, I'm not worried. Philosophically, am I worried? I think we haven't reached a point where I think AI reached a level where there's a flipping point where we completely lose control over it. And I don't know, I'm not into science fiction to even come up with any predictions on that. Anywhere? Yes.
So, so when you're dealing with these kind of models, how do you deal with stuff like the black box problem, where you're not really sure 100% why you're getting the output that you're getting? Or what about the other problem where there could be unintended biases? Like there's been controversies where people have an algorithm to select for interviews, but then it shows a systemic bias that is undesirable.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the explainability, that's been a very hard problem to solve for a long time. Like, especially anytime you use any complicated model and you get a prediction, a lot of times our customers are like, well, why did that model predict this value? And then, so one way at least we do it in Darwin is like I think Kevin talked about all this, like feature importance. Is like, can we tell the customer, okay, we predicted this value because these features or these columns in the data indicated that. And there's been a paper called there's different methods. There's a Lime method. There's Shape values that is kind of more like Lime-like. So basically, you try to find the features that are most important when that predicts the value. So that's one way of explaining the black box, or at least looking on why, maybe like fitting more a linear model across that black box for certain values. But in general, it's a hard problem to solve, well, globally, because but yeah, feature importance is like one way, but really you need to like backpropagate through the network and then extract why the network made every decision it did, right? To be able to completely open that black box. Does that answer your question, or? But where does the bias come from? Sorry? Oh, okay. So you like overfitting, or is that kind of?
One example was that I believe there was something in the vision where, for selecting interviews, there was a bias in terms of who was being selected, and that was undesirable.
So if the bias is coming from the model, then or is it from the data? Because the bias can be in the data, then you really can't do anything about it. But if the bias is a mistake of the model, then a lot of times what we do is you can test the model with other data sets that they have either different bias or unbiased. So then you can see how it behaves. Yeah, I'm not sure. There's Randy, my manager, then I see.
Yeah, I think the one you're talking about, Amazon tried to do something to help them with their interviews, and so they fed in all these resumes and then who was selected, and of course it ended up having a bias to male applicants because that had been the history of what they had hired in the past. So the problem was in the training data, and if you aren't careful about how you select your training data, the model's going to learn the bias of what you've done in the past, right? So and I think there's similar ones with facial recognition, by being able to determine the sex of a person by facial recognition. There's been lots of problems with it having a race bias, that it's better at detecting the sex of white people than it is of other races, just because, again, a lot more training data that was fed into the model, and so a lot of people have had to go back and fix their training data in order to solve the problem.
Anyone else?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so with that, I guess we had a great presentation. Two of the speakers from Spark Cognition. Again, recognizing Spark Cognition for the sponsorship, and we look forward to the next year sponsorship as well. We're planning for the next year. Keep in touch, and we'll keep posted on what's coming in. So with that, I think we're at the end of the meetup today, and feel free to grab any food that is left over, and also there are some T-shirts there if you want to contribute to the meetup groups. Grab one, and so yeah. So with that, have a good night, and we'll see you next year. Thank you.